The morning started like any other Tuesday in Willowbrook Estates, our pristine suburban neighborhood where the biggest controversy usually involves someone's grass being a quarter-inch too tall. I was in my garage workshop, meticulously cleaning my collection of military surplus equipment, a hobby I'd developed after my discharge from the Army's EOD unit 3 years prior. The familiar weight of the deactivated flashbang training devices in my hands brought back memories of clearing buildings in Afghanistan, though now they served as conversation pieces and reminders of a life I'd left behind. That's when I heard the vehicles, not just one car, but multiple engines rumbling down Maple Street in perfect formation. Through my garage window, I watched as a convoy of black SUVs and sedan cars pulled up to my driveway like some kind of federal raid. My heart rate spiked, old habits from my military days kicking in as I assessed the situation. But instead of tactical gear and weapons, outstepped Harold Pemberton, the HOA president, flanked by what appeared to be the entire Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association board, plus several people I didn't recognize carrying clipboards and cameras. Marcus. Thompson. Harold's voice boomed across my front yard with the authority of someone who'd clearly been practicing this moment in front of his bathroom mirror. By the power vested in me by the Willowbrook Estates Community Charter, I hereby serve you notice of immediate property inspection and violation citation. I stepped out of my garage, still holding one of the training flashbangs, and immediately noticed how the entire group took a collective step backward. Harold's face went pale, but he pressed on with his rehearsed speech, waving a thick folder of papers like a medieval herald announcing a royal decree. You have been in violation of community standards for exactly 47 days, he continued, his voice cracking slightly. Your grass exceeds the permitted height by 3/4 of an inch. Your mailbox is painted in an unauthorized shade of blue, and according to Mrs. Henderson's report, you've been conducting suspicious activities in your garage at all hours of the night. I couldn't help but laugh, a sound that seemed to further unnerve the assembled HOA tribunal. The suspicious activities were my woodworking projects and equipment maintenance, hardly the stuff of neighborhood scandals. But Harold had always been the type to turn molehills into mountains, especially when it came to asserting his authority over our little suburban kingdom. Harold, what exactly are you trying to accomplish here? I asked, setting the training device on my workbench behind me. You could have just knocked on my door like a normal neighbor. Normal? Harold's eyes widened with indignation. Normal is following the rules, Mr. Thompson. Normal is maintaining property values. Normal is not hoarding military explosives in your garage. The irony wasn't lost on me. These were the same neighbors who'd thanked me for my service at the annual block party, who'd asked me to help them hang American flags on Veterans Day, who'd nodded approvingly when I'd mentioned my military background. But now, faced with evidence of that same service, they were treating me like a domestic terrorist. Those aren't explosives, I explained patiently, gesturing toward my workbench. They're deactivated training devices, completely harmless. I use them for educational presentations at the local VFW hall. But Harold was already in full bureaucratic mode, consulting his clipboard and barking orders to his assembled team. Jenkins, start documenting every violation. Patricia, get photos of everything. And someone call the authorities. I want this arsenal properly investigated. The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond the typical HOA power trip. I recognized the signs from my military days. The way Harold's breathing had quickened, the slight tremor in his hands, the way he kept glancing at my garage as if expecting it to explode at any moment. He was genuinely afraid, which made him dangerous in the way that only frightened people with authority can be. Look, Harold, I said, trying to defuse the situation, why don't you and I sit down and talk about this like adults? I'm sure we can work out whatever issues you have with my property maintenance. No! Harold's voice reached a fever pitch. No more talking, no more delays. This neighborhood has standards, Mr. Thompson, and you've been thumbing your nose at them for months. Mrs. Henderson has documented 17 separate violations, and today we're going to catalog every single one. Mrs. Henderson, a woman in her 70s who spent most of her day peering through her curtains at the neighborhood activities, stepped forward with a thick binder. She'd apparently been conducting surveillance on my property with the dedication of a private investigator, complete with timestamps and photographs. Here's photographic evidence of improper trash can placement, she announced, flipping through her binder with theatrical flair. Lawn maintenance performed outside of approved hours. Suspicious individuals visiting the property after dark, which were actually just pizza delivery drivers, but still highly irregular. The absurdity of the situation was beginning to outweigh my initial amusement. These people had organized what amounted to a neighborhood militia to confront me about grass height and mailbox colors. They'd turned a simple property dispute into some kind of military operation, complete with documentation and backup personnel. And furthermore, Harold continued, his confidence growing as he fed off the energy of his supporters, we have reason to believe you've been conducting unauthorized business activities on residential property. The noise levels from your garage exceed community standards, and the constant stream of visitors suggest commercial activity. The unauthorized business activities were my volunteer work repairing equipment for local veterans organizations, and the constant stream of visitors consisted of maybe 3 people per week dropping off or picking up items. But in Harold's mind, I'd apparently transformed into some kind of suburban arms dealer operating out of my garage. I think you're all getting a little carried away here, I said, my patience beginning to wear thin. This is still America, and I still have rights as a property owner. You can't just storm onto my property and start making accusations without cause. Actually, we can, Harold said with a smug smile, producing another set of papers from his folder. According to Section 12B of the Community Charter, which you signed when you purchased your property, the HOA has the right to conduct inspections when violations are reported, and Mrs. Henderson has reported plenty of violations. The legal technicalities were probably questionable, but Harold had clearly done his homework. He'd found enough bureaucratic loopholes to justify his actions, at least in his own mind. The problem was that his interpretation of those rules was about as flexible as a steel beam and twice as rigid. As the HOA team began spreading out across my property, taking photographs and making notes, I realized this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. Harold had come prepared for war, and he wasn't going to back down until he'd claimed his victory. The question was, what exactly did he think he was going to accomplish by turning a neighbor dispute into a full-scale siege? The answer, I suspected, was about to become very clear and very complicated. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my neighbors and myself. Just as Harold's inspection team began their systematic violation of my privacy, a new vehicle pulled up to the curb, a beat-up pickup truck that looked completely out of place among the HOA's fleet of pristine SUVs. Out stepped Tom Reeves, a grizzled man in his 60s whom I'd only spoken to a handful of times since moving to the neighborhood. He lived 3 houses down in what Harold often referred to as the eyesore property, due to Tom's preference for practical landscaping over HOA-approved aesthetic perfection. What the hell is going on here? Tom's voice cut through the morning, air like a rusty blade, causing several HOA members to freeze mid-documentation. Harold straightened his tie and cleared his throat. This doesn't concern you, Tom. We're conducting official HOA business with Mr. Thompson regarding multiple property violations. Multiple violations? Tom's weathered face broke into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. You mean like the 3/4-inch grass height you tried to cite me for last month? Or maybe the unauthorized garden gnome you demanded I remove from my own damn yard? The tension in the air shifted palpably. I hadn't realized that Harold's reign of suburban terror extended beyond my property lines. Tom walked over to where I stood, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway with the confidence of someone who'd stopped caring about other people's opinions decades ago. Marcus, isn't it? Tom extended a calloused hand. Marine Corps 78-85. Heard you were Army EOD Afghanistan? 2 tours, I replied, shaking his hand and immediately feeling the firm grip of someone who understood what real problems looked like. I didn't know you were military. Most people don't, but I recognize the way you maintain your gear. Tom nodded toward my garage workshop. My grandson's been thinking about EOD training, been meaning to ask if you'd talk to him about it. Harold's face was turning an interesting shade of purple. This is highly irregular. Tom, you have no authority to interfere with official HOA proceedings. Official? Tom laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. Harold, you're not the FBI. You're a retired insurance adjuster with delusions of grandeur and too much time on your hands. That's when Mrs. Henderson made her crucial mistake. Well, I never, she huffed, clutching her violation binder like a shield. Tom Reeves, you're just as bad as him with your military nonsense. Both of you think you can do whatever you want. Just because you served in some war nobody remembers. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Harold seemed to realize that Mrs. Henderson had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed, especially not in front of a group of neighbors who'd grown up respecting military service. But the damage was done, and Tom's expression shifted from amused tolerance to something much more dangerous. Nobody remembers? Tom's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more authority than Harold's loudest proclamations. Lady, I lost 3 friends in a place you couldn't find on a map, and this man probably saved more lives in a day than you've helped in your entire miserable existence. So maybe you should shut your mouth before you say something you'll really regret. Chopper. HOA inspection team began to look uncomfortable, shifting their weight and avoiding eye contact. These were ordinary suburban residents who'd probably never seen real conflict, and they were suddenly witnessing the kind of confrontation that made their neighborhood squabbles seem petty and ridiculous. But Harold, perhaps sensing that his authority was slipping away, decided to double down on his attack. This is exactly the problem, he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. You military types think you're above the rules. You think your service gives you the right to ignore community standards and threaten law-abiding citizens. Threaten? I stepped forward, my own patience finally reaching its breaking point. Harold, the only person making threats here is you. You showed up at my house with a dozen people, invaded my property, and started making accusations about explosives and illegal activities. If anyone's being threatened, it's me. Tom nodded grimly. And from what I can see, Marcus here has been more patient with your nonsense than you deserve. Most EOD guys I know would have shut this circus down the moment you stepped foot on their property. Harold's eyes darted nervously between Tom and me, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was realizing that his carefully planned power play was backfiring spectacularly, but he was too invested to back down gracefully. You're both trying to intimidate me, Harold declared, pulling out his phone. I'm calling the police right now. I'm reporting both of you for threatening behavior and possible weapons violations. That's when the real twist revealed itself. Another vehicle pulled up to the curb, this one a police cruiser with Officer Sarah Chen behind the wheel. Sarah was someone I recognized from the local VFW meetings, a veteran herself who'd served in the Navy before joining the local police force. She stepped out of her car with the measured pace of someone who'd already heard enough to know exactly what kind of situation she was walking into. Morning, Marcus. Sarah nodded to me, then turned to Tom. Tom, how's the grandson doing with his college applications? Getting there, Tom replied with a slight smile. Might have some questions for Marcus here about EOD work if that's all right. Good program, Sarah agreed, then turned her attention to Harold. Mr. Pemberton, I understand you called in a complaint about weapons violations and threatening behavior? Harold straightened up, clearly relieved that law enforcement had arrived to validate his authority. Yes, Officer Chen. Mr. Thompson has been storing military explosives in his garage, and both he and Mr. Reeves have been making threatening statements. I demand you search the premises immediately. Sarah walked over to my garage and examined the training devices on my workbench. She picked up one of the deactivated flashbangs, turned it over in her hands, and read the clearly marked training device inert stamping on the side. Harold, she said with the tone of someone explaining something to a particularly slow child, these are deactivated training aids. They're about as dangerous as paperweights. Marcus uses them for educational presentations at the VFW hall. I've seen his presentation myself. It's actually quite informative. The color drained from Harold's face as he realized that his ace, in the hole, the police intervention he'd counted on to validate his authority, was instead exposing him as a paranoid busybody with no understanding of what he was talking about. But they look like real explosives, Harold sputtered. So does a realistic toy gun, Sarah replied patiently. That doesn't make it illegal to own one. Now, about these threatening statements you mentioned, what exactly was said? Mrs. Henderson stepped forward eagerly. Tom Reeves told me to shut my mouth. He was clearly threatening me. Sarah turned to Tom with raised eyebrows. Is that accurate, Tom? Well, Tom scratched his chin thoughtfully. I did suggest she might want to consider not talking, given that she'd just insulted military veterans in front of a group of neighbors. But I don't recall making any threats. Did you hear any threats, Marcus? None whatsoever, I replied honestly. Tom was defending our service record against some pretty offensive comments. If anything, he showed remarkable restraint. Sarah nodded and made a few notes in her report book. Harold, from what I can see here, you've organized what amounts to a mob to confront a neighbor over minor property violations, made false accusations about illegal weapons, and wasted police resources. On a complaint that has no basis, in fact. Is that an accurate summary? The HOA inspection team was beginning to disperse, several members quietly returning to their vehicles as they realized the spectacle was not going in their favor. Harold stood alone in my driveway, his folder of violations looking increasingly pathetic in his trembling hands. But the story was far from over. As Sarah finished writing her report, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the distinctive electronic whine of an activating flashbang device. Someone had accidentally triggered one of my training units, and in about 3 seconds, everyone on my property was about to get the surprise of their lives. Time slowed to a crawl as my EOD training kicked in. The electronic whine wasn't coming from one of my deactivated training devices. It was coming from something else entirely. My eyes swept across my garage workshop in a fraction of a second, cataloging every item, every surface, every possible source of that terrifyingly familiar sound. That's when I saw him. Jenkins, Harold's documentation specialist, was crouched behind my workbench with what looked like a small electronic device in his hands. But this wasn't one of my training aids. This was something he'd brought with him, something that was now emitting the unmistakable pre-detonation warning of an active flashbang grenade. Everyone down! I roared, my voice carrying the authority of 1,000 training exercises and 2 combat tours. Real device! Take cover now! The next 3 seconds played out like a choreographed dance of chaos. Sarah Chen, recognizing the urgency in my voice, immediately tackled Harold to the ground, behind a parked car. Tom Reeves, drawing on decades-old Marine training, grabbed Mrs. Henderson and dove behind my truck. The remaining HOA members scattered like startled birds, some diving behind vehicles, others simply dropping flat on the asphalt. But Jenkins, poor confused Jenkins, just stood there holding the device, staring at it with the blank expression of someone who had no idea what he'd just activated. I launched myself across the garage, my body moving on pure instinct and muscle memory. 3 years of civilian life melted away in an instant, replaced by the razor-sharp focus that had kept me alive in Afghanistan. I tackled Jenkins to the ground just as the flashbang detonated, shielding him with my body as the world exploded into blinding light and deafening noise. The explosion wasn't as powerful as a military-grade device, but it was real enough to shatter every window in my garage and set off car alarms throughout the neighborhood. The flash painted everything in stark white for several seconds, and the concussive blast left my ears ringing like church bells. When the light faded and the initial shock wore off, I found myself lying on top of Jenkins behind my workbench, both of us covered in dust and debris. He was conscious but dazed, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You okay?" I asked, though my voice sounded muffled and distant through the ringing in my ears. Jenkins nodded weakly, then looked down at the twisted remains of the device in his hands. I don't understand," he whispered. "It was supposed to be fake." That's when the real truth began to unravel. As I helped Jenkins to his feet, Sarah Chen appeared at my side, her service weapon drawn and her eyes scanning for additional threats. Her police training had taken over the moment she heard an actual explosive device, and she was treating this as a potential terrorism incident. "Marcus, are you hurt?" she asked, her voice sharp and professional. "I'm fine," I replied, checking Jenkins for injuries. "But we need to figure out where that device came from. It wasn't one of mine." Harold emerged from behind the car, his expensive suit torn and dirty, his carefully styled hair now looking like he'd stuck his finger in an electrical socket. But instead of the fear I expected to see, his face showed something much more disturbing: satisfaction. "Well," Harold said, dusting off his jacket with shaking hands, "I think that proves my point about the dangers of storing military equipment in residential areas." Sarah's head snapped toward Harold so fast I thought she might give herself whiplash. "Excuse me? Are you suggesting you knew that device was active?" "Of course not," Harold protested. But there was something in his voice, a nervous quality that suggested he wasn't being entirely truthful. "I'm just saying that this incident validates our concerns about Mr. Thompson's collection." That's when Tom Reeves, who'd been helping Mrs. Henderson to her feet, made a discovery that changed everything. "Marcus," Tom called out, holding up a small piece of paper he'd found near where Jenkins had been crouched. "You might want to see this." The paper was a receipt from Miller's Military Surplus, a shop about 20 miles outside of town. It was dated 3 days ago and showed the purchase of one Flashbang training device, modified, for $75. The purchaser's name was clearly printed at the bottom: Harold J. Pemberton. The silence that followed was more deafening than the flashbang itself. Sarah took the receipt from Tom and studied it carefully, her expression growing darker with each passing second. When she looked up at Harold, her eyes held the cold fury of a law enforcement officer who'd just realized she'd been manipulated. "Harold," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm, "would you like to explain why you purchased a modified flashbang device 3 days ago?" Harold's face went through several color changes, red to white to green and back to red again. That's not... You don't understand the context." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Sarah replied, pulling out her handcuffs. "You purchased an active explosive device, brought it to a neighbor's property, and had your associate plant it to make it look like Mr. Thompson was storing dangerous materials. That's called manufacturing evidence, Harold. It's also called assault with a dangerous weapon." The remaining HOA members, who'd been slowly emerging from their various hiding spots, suddenly found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Cars started and tires squealed as Harold's inspection team fled the scene like cockroaches when the kitchen light comes on. But Mrs. Henderson surprised everyone by staying put. "I knew it," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of anger and vindication. "I knew Harold was planning something when he asked me to document all those violations. He kept pushing me to find more problems, more reasons to go after Marcus. I thought it was just his usual power trip, but this..." She trailed off, staring at Harold with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd been used as a pawn in someone else's chess game. Jenkins, meanwhile, was slowly coming to terms with what had happened. "Harold told me it was a harmless noisemaker," he said, his voice growing stronger as the shock wore off. "He said it would make a loud pop and some smoke, just enough to make it look like Mr. Thompson's equipment was dangerous. He never said anything about a real explosive." Sarah nodded grimly as she approached Harold with her handcuffs. "Harold Pemberton, you're under arrest for assault with a dangerous weapon, manufacturing false evidence, and reckless endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." But Harold wasn't done yet. As Sarah began reading him his rights, his mask of suburban respectability finally slipped completely away, revealing the petty tyrant underneath. "You don't understand!" Harold screamed, struggling against the handcuffs. "This neighborhood was perfect before he moved in. Perfect lawns, perfect houses, perfect families. Then he shows up with his military junk and his attitude, thinking he's better than everyone else just because he served in some desert war." "Harold, you're making this worse for yourself," Sarah warned. "I don't care." Harold's voice reached a fever pitch. "Someone had to do something. Someone had to show everyone what kind of danger he represents. Those training devices could have been real bombs. Those visitors to his garage could have been terrorists. I was protecting this community." The paranoid rambling continued for another minute before Sarah finally got Harold secured in the back of her police cruiser. As she closed the door on his increasingly frantic protests, the neighborhood fell into an eerie quiet broken only by the distant sound of sirens, backup units, and the bomb squad, responding to Sarah's earlier call for assistance. I looked around, at the aftermath of Harold's scheme. My garage windows were shattered, my lawn was torn up from people diving for cover, and my normally peaceful Tuesday morning had been transformed into something resembling a small-scale war zone. But as I surveyed the damage, I realized something unexpected had happened. Tom Reeves was already measuring my broken windows, muttering about replacement costs and offering to help with repairs. Mrs. Henderson was apologizing profusely for her role in Harold's surveillance operation and asking if there was anything she could do to make amends. Even Jenkins, despite being manipulated into nearly killing everyone present, was offering to pay for damages and testifying against Harold's scheme. The HOA's attempted coup had backfired so spectacularly that it had actually brought the neighborhood together, united in their shared experience of surviving Harold's explosive power grab and their collective realization of what a petty tyrant he'd become. As the bomb squad arrived to secure the scene and the paramedics checked everyone for injuries, I couldn't help but smile. Harold had tried to use fear and false evidence to turn my neighbors against me, but instead, he'd managed to expose himself as the real threat to community peace and safety. The flashbang that was supposed to frame me had instead illuminated the truth for everyone to see. And sometimes, I reflected as I watched Harold's police cruiser disappear down Maple Street. The most explosive revelations are the ones that bring people together rather than tear them apart. The war for Willowbrook Estates was over, and the good guys had won, not through violence or deception, but through the simple power of truth and the bonds forged between people who'd faced danger together and emerged stronger on the other side.